Welcome to A Soulfull Podcast. I'm Ahriana Platten, your host, and my guest today is Dr. Thomas Jay Oord. Dr. Oord is a theologian, a philosopher, and a scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He's an award-winning author and an award-winning professor. Dr. Oord directs the Northwind Theological Seminary doctoral program in Open and Relational Theology and the Center for Open and Relational Theology. He's known for his contributions to research on love, issues in science and religion, and freedom for transformation. Dr. Oord lectures at institutions, events, and churches around the globe, and you can find him at www.thomasjayoord.com. So glad to have you here. This is episode 1 of A Soulfull Podcast. I have been waiting to do this podcast for such a long time. My guest this morning is Dr. Thomas Oord. And Tom, you are an author, and folks will have heard your bio coming into this. But I want to jump right in because our objective is to go deep, real, and raw.
Great.
I want to invite you to tell us what your bio doesn't tell us. What do we need to know about who you are to really understand what it is that you bring into the world?
This morning, I awoke in bed and did something that I do most mornings. I set my intentions to live a life of love. That's what matters most to me. I don't want on my gravestone when I die, he was a great theologian or whatever. He tried to live a life of love. And that takes a ton of different avenues, dimensions, explores all kinds of possibilities. It affects my personal, my social life. It affects everything about who I am. But at the foundation is this attempt to be a loving person moment by moment. I don't think that's in my bio, but that's at the heart of who I am.
That's awesome. That's I have, I should probably start by explaining to folks that Dr. Oord and I have this is our first real conversation. I have read your book, Open and Relation. Now I can't name the book.
Open and Relational Theology, probably.
Thank you. Yes. That's where I started, and then followed you on Facebook. I'm not an avid reader. As much as I enjoy reading, my life these days doesn't allow nearly as much time for that as I would like. So I tend to be, I've listened to you on 1,000 podcasts.
Okay, great.
You are not hard to find. If people like what you have to say, you are not hard to find. You have numerous books on the market and a real opinion to share about God. And I wanted, because this is our first podcast, I want to define that for me, when I use that word could be God, goddess, all that is, divine presence, love, life, quantum source. This name God is something that it's kind of a catch-all word, isn't it?
Sure.
It's kind of, it's an umbrella word for lots of things. So we're going to use that word today, but don't allow it, if you're listening or watching this, don't allow it to limit your perception or think that we're limiting your perception of the holy.
Good.
So speaking of the holy, our followers here, the people who are joining us in A Soulfull World, are primarily intuitives and healers who have personal experience, and you are an academic. So a lot of what I hear from you is academically based, but I'm really curious what this thing called God is to you, and like, how do you experience the holy? How does that happen for you?
Maybe it would help if I gave a little bit of a history to the journey to where I am now and thinking about the big G word, God. I grew up in a fairly traditional Christian home, evangelical home, you might say. I took belief in God very seriously, read the Holy Scriptures, was a evangelist, involved in faith healing. I was all in. And then I took a course in philosophy of religion when I was in college that rocked my world. Um, for the first time, I started reading really smart atheists, agnostics, people from other religious traditions. And the reasons I had for thinking there was a God at all just didn't make any sense anymore. And I became an atheist. My vision of God prior to that moment was, I like to think it was fairly sophisticated. I didn't think God was some old guy up in the heavens with a long beard throwing lightning bolts. But I still retain this particular view of God's power that basically had God in charge. God didn't control everything as I understood it then, but God made sure the good stuff, or the important stuff at least, really happened. And God made the universe the way it is, or pretty much the way it is. And this class threw all that into question. And I eventually emerged on the other side of atheism, believing in a um, very sparse notion of what the divine is. I had two fundamental reasons to return to belief in God. One was my search for ultimate meaning. I didn't think I could have something like ultimate meaning if God didn't somehow play a role in that. And this deep intuition that I ought to be a loving person, and that God was somehow the source of that love. And in the process of working out what that might mean, I don't claim to know God fully. I'm not even certain God exists. I think it's plausible, but I am not certain. But in the midst of that, my sort of fundamental approach to thinking about the divine began with the questions and issues of love. And then I allowed those issues to reshape what the traditional view of God might be, or what I expected God to be. So, for instance, I no longer think God has controlling power like I used to have because of my beginnings of love. So that gives you a little bit of a taste for what I mean when I use the word God. Some of the things I mean sound kind of familiar to people, like I actually think God is a universal spirit who knows everything that's possible to know and is active in my life and all of creation and every universe that exists. But fundamentally, it's this notion that this divine God, the spirit, is the one who is the source of love and inspires me and others to love. And that means there's some traditional views of God that I reject. I don't think God knows the future, for instance. I don't think God is in control or can even be in control in any kind of single-handed or unilateral way. I think God cares for everyone, all creatures, and so there's no one religion that God likes and hates all the others. So I have a lot of things that I veer away from the God of my youth, but there are still a few things that I retain from that vision.
That is why I asked you to be here.
Great.
That what you explained is exactly why I asked you to be here. And my background is that I grew up Catholic. Mm-hmm. I moved from Catholicism, which would not allow me to serve in a clergy way. Mm-hmm. I moved from Catholicism into college campus evangelical witnessing and speaking in tongues and all of that, and still found that the fact that I'm a woman was a problem. And so I left that entirely and went 180 degrees across to pre-Christian European traditions, paganism, exploration of indigenous cultures. And then kind of after many, many years there, 20 years there, came back into metaphysical Christianity through New Thought and
Oh,
10 years in New Thought ministry.
yeah. Okay. Interesting.
So I have a really broad interpretation when it comes to understanding all of the faces of the holy, all the ways that we might experience the holy. And I've just spent a lot of time talking with a lot of people, doing a lot of interfaith work, trying to build bridges between people so that they're able to share ideas, share possibilities, and come to an understanding that there is so much, really so much to consider. I would say the biggest, the day that I felt like I was going to get kicked out of my church was the day I asked my congregation, what if God is not perfect? What if our idea, what if what we're imposing on God is a picture of something that we believe to be perfect, that we name, because words are a real problem?
Sure.
And what if what you think is perfect is not the condition of the holy? So when you speak about a God who is not, doesn't have the picture of the whole future, is not, has not created every step we will walk on this path,
Right.
that have gotten you in some trouble somewhere along the line.
Lots of troubles along those lines. Yeah. I've been kicked out of universities for teaching that sort of thing, and pushed out of groups. And yeah, that way of thinking that God doesn't have everything predetermined, God doesn't have a blueprint plan for everything, that the future is not settled, not even known by God, that it's a realm of possibilities. That, in my mind, is a very freeing and beautiful thing. It means that my life matters, my choices matters, that that what I do can have a real contribution to what the future will be. But there are lots of people who find that view troubling, threatening. It means, by implication, that the current state of affairs, the status quo, isn't necessarily what God wants it to be. And it can change because of what we do. And those people who are in power, and sometimes that's me, but sometimes it's not, people in power often like the status quo, and they don't want to see change. And the idea that the future is open, they see that as something that they don't like. It's a threat.
Yeah. And it also changes our perception of prayer, which
Definitely.
so many people really rely on to kind of manage their life. And so, how we pray, if we pray in a beseeching way, please make this turn out the way I want it. And we understand that holy source is not making the future happen a certain way. And
Right.
what is prayer for?
Yeah.
How do we use prayer?
So I'm the title that I like to use for my way of thinking, you've already mentioned, which is open and relational theology. And as a part of that movement, I not only think the future is open and that God is relational, I think God simply can't control anyone or anything, not just humans or other creatures. God can't even control the quarks. God is always influencing and acting, but never controlling. And so when people hear that, they oftentimes find it very helpful, because then it means that God's not the source of the evil in the world. But then they say to me, yeah, but what about prayer? And what they mean by that is petitionary prayer, not just, telling God what's your worries or your joys or whatever, but asking God to do something. And I like to respond by saying there are three ways of thinking about prayer that I find unsatisfactory, and one that I like. So let me quickly go through the three that I don't like. I don't like the idea that a few people, not the majority, but some people have, that there exists a God who is in control and predetermined everything from the foundation of the world, that everything is not only foreknown by God, but foreordained. If you have that view of God, it makes no sense, in my way of thinking, to pray and ask God to change something in the future, because that God has already predetermined everything that's ever going to happen. So petitionary prayer doesn't really make any sense in that view. More people I know take the second approach to prayer. They don't think God predestined everything, but they think God has the kind of controlling power that God just might decide to control something in the next moment because of what we've asked God to do. So, if we ask God to heal your Aunt Mary's cancer, God has the ability to just single-handedly do that, and just might do that in the next moment because you ask. The problem with that view is that you start to wonder why God isn't doing a lot more healing, why God isn't answering a whole lot more of your prayers in a single-handed way. And then you start to think, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm just not praying hard enough, or I've only prayed 37 times instead of 800 times. Or maybe God is punishing me. Maybe God doesn't want to listen to me because I'm just a rotten person. You have all these kinds of issues that start to arise because you assume God could just up and fix something instantaneously all alone. And you ask God to do that. And it's not like you're always asking God for a new Lamborghini. Sometimes you're asking God to heal someone, and that's really important. And you would think that a God of love would want to heal everybody. So why doesn't this God heal? That particular view of God is a view that I think is most common and most troubling, because it's hard to imagine God as perfectly loving if God could just up and heal single-handedly and doesn't do so on a consistent basis. So what happens for a lot of people is they see the problems with those first two models of petitionary prayer, and they go to a third model that kind of basically takes God out of the picture. And it says, my prayers can affect me. Prayers change me, but they don't change God. Now, I think prayers can have a real effect on our lives. So I'm in favor of that. And I don't think our prayers change God in the sense that we can make God go from being loving to being evil. So I think God can't be changed in that way. But as a relational theologian, I think God is actually affected by everything we do. And prayer is something that we do. So this fourth model says this: our prayers really impact or influence God in one moment, and they can open up new possibilities, opportunities, avenues for divine action in the next moment that may not have been there had we not acted in the previous moment, had we not prayed. So in this fourth model, God doesn't have controlling power. We can't pray and say, God, I want you to single-handedly heal Aunt Mary's cancer. God can't do that from my model. But God can take whatever data is in the world, including our prayers, and use that in the utmost way possible in the next moment to offer healing or whatever in the circumstances. And so in that model of prayer, our prayers really do make a difference. The healings that occur, we can say, have been influenced by us and other factors, but God doesn't have the kind of controlling, omnipotent power that most people think God has.
It's really interesting to listen to these different perspectives, and many of them I'm in agreement with in terms of my own personal experience. I think for me, I tend to use prayer as a way to change my state of being.
Sure.
That prayer for me is much more about calling from my own heart what is the sense of divine moving through me.
Yep.
And bringing myself to a place of balance so that my thoughts and my actions are aligned back with love, with divine source, rather than out of fear or anger or frustration or whatever else happens to be flowing through me. And so
I'm the same way. Yeah.
yeah.
I oftentimes mostly pray with my own issues in mind. But you've also been a congregational leader.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you're asked to stand in front of a group of people and offer a prayer on behalf of the people. And not everybody's going to listen to you pray, but some of the people are going to listen to you pray. And I think God is listening to you. And so then that prayer somehow not only affects you, but it affects the people listening. And in an interrelated universe, which I think the universe is like, that means that what we do extends beyond the impact or influence on our own selves. And I find that um, alluring. I find that invigorating. Um, yeah, something that's interesting and positive.
So when you speak kind of, I often think of Rumi, and Rumi's conversation always comes back to being in relationship with the beloved.
Mm,
When you speak, and it's hard not to do this too, you speak of this other being.
yeah.
And New Thought in particular, but also a lot of branches of specifically pre-Christian European tradition kind of positions that interconnection as the God that is all things in
Mm-hmm.
a pantheistic or panentheistic kind of way. How do your beliefs fall in line with that or out of line with that?
Yeah, I embrace panentheism. In fact, I have a particular brand of panentheism I call theocosmocentrism, but I won't go there for the moment.
No, you can't walk away from that. I want to know what that is.
Well, the word panentheism, as many of your listeners probably know, means all things are in God. And that's different from saying all things are God. But at least in the academy, panentheism, saying all things are in God, has at least a dozen different meanings. And some of those meanings I like, and some of them I don't like. And so the word panentheism has become a little problematic in academic circles. There's been lots of books and essays written on, what is panentheism? Why even use the word? It has so many meanings, and yada, yada, yada. So I decided I was going to invent my own version of panentheism that I call theocosmocentrism. And it says that God and creation always ought to be considered when we think about the big questions. It says that God is necessarily and everlastingly intertwined or interrelated with creaturely others. It says that God is always loving creaturely others. In fact, there's never been a time in which God existed all alone. So I reject a phrase you've probably heard in your Catholic upbringing, creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. I think God has everlastingly been creating creaturely others. So that sounds very God and creation enmeshed kind of a notion. But I don't equate God with creation. So I do think God is other than the created the created order. I think God is other than me and you and this microphone and whatever else. So God is transcendent in that way, in the sense of not being me, but God is always interrelated, always influenced by me and influencing me and all of creation. That's what I mean by theocosmocentrism as a version of panentheism.
So when you say that, a lot of the people that are in this community, myself included, have had that experience of speaking or healing or interacting with a person they're in service to, where there is that sense that something is moving through them that is not them.
Yeah.
For me, it happens when I have a sermon in line. I know exactly what I'm going to talk about. I'm ready to go, and I open my mouth, and something else
Sure.
is on the agenda that I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And those things kind of flow through you in a way that is very clear that they're not coming from you. You're not
Yeah.
inventing this in your head as you go along. This is actually flowing through you. Talk a little bit about your understanding of this holy source moving through us as expression.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe strongly in that. I've had the same kind of experiences. I think every moment of life has some dimension of both God and creaturely action. It's just that there are certain times in which we feel like the divine movement seems to be prominent, seems to be preeminent in that particular moment. And other times it feels as if God is not really around much. And I think God is still present and active, but it's just God's not preeminent in those moments. But I'm kind of committed to this notion that there's never a moment in which God is absent, but there's also never a moment in which God is totally controlling us, and we're never robots. But there can be degrees of divine influence as we respond well or poorly to this moment by moment persuasion or wooing of the loving spirit in our lives and in the universe. Um, and that way of thinking, as I see it, helps me to overcome all kinds of conceptual problems about, like, the question, well, if God can take over and control me so that good things happen, then why doesn't God do that more often or all the time? Or even worse, if God can control us, then why doesn't God stop the rapist? um, on the other hand, um, and I'm very much in the science and religion dialogue and written several books there. And sometimes science operates as if there's only creaturely action in the world and God is bracketed out of anything. And I want to say, no, even in those cases in which we don't witness with our five senses divine action at play, we ought to assume God is still influencing. So, in my way of thinking, science can never be totally devoid of divine action. And so that kind of way of thinking about every moment, including both creaturely and divine causation or action, allows me to avoid what I think are two problems at the extreme, which say sometimes God only acts and sometimes only creatures act and God's not involved.
Yeah, interesting. This kind of all things are interconnected.
Yeah.
Our actions impact everybody else's actions. Our who we are in the world, in and how we
Yes.
move in the world, it impacts not only human life but all life on the planet.
Totally agree.
That stuff for me is kind of seated in, and this goes back to where you started, is kind of seated in the understanding of love and a willingness to be, I know for me what happens when I'm up on the platform is that a willingness to let love move me in whatever direction is going to serve the people that are there on that day in whatever condition they have come. So
Beautiful.
I don't have any feeling of being taken by God. I
Yeah.
have been in churches where, people are falling out in the aisles and
Sure.
they
So
are
have
definitely
I.
feel taken by God. That
Yeah.
is not my experience. My experience has always been seated in a willingness,
Yeah.
in a, kind of, there's actually for me, when I start a prayer practice that I do, um, that is to take the image of the Vesica Pisces, to start with two circles and move them together in my mind
Mm.
and find that open space where two become one, and to
Mm-hmm.
go into that with a willingness that I am in partnership as I do that particular work. Because for me, there's a bit of a weight that people listen to what I have to say. There's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit on my shoulders that is, please guide me
Yes.
to speak from a place that is healing and brings comfort and brings to people what they need, as opposed to my own ego playing in and even having the potential to cause damage. So
Yep.
so
I
I
have
love,
that
yeah,
same sense of responsibility when I speak or act. Yeah.
yeah. And when you talk about coming from love and beginning your day each day with this objective of moving from love, thinking from love, speaking from love, that's really meshes well with the way I try
Mm,
and move through life.
good.
So it's not always easy to do that.
No.
It's not always easy. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that come up for you in living from love.
Yeah, well, two challenges come up to mind quickly. One is an emotional challenge. Sometimes things happen to me that give me very negative emotions. I'm on Facebook and someone, bombs me with all kinds of criticism, or Uh, Yesterday, I'm at a stop sign. It was my turn to go. I go, but another vehicle thought it was their turn to go, and they honked their horn. They flipped me off, and like my emotions go negative. In those moments, I have to respond to those negative emotions by thinking about what's the positive thing I can do and say. How can I, to use my definition of love, how can I respond or act intentionally in response to God and my situation to promote overall well-being? And so one of the obstacles I face at times is dealing with negative emotions. And those can come in all kinds of different forms, but I think most people get the idea there. The second issue that I quickly came to mind is that even when I want to do what is good, that promotes overall well-being, it's often not clear to me what action I should take. So let's go to the person flipping me off. What is the best thing to do in that scenario? I'm pretty sure the best thing is not to steer my car into the other car and smash them, right? That's kind of off the table. That's pretty
Yeah.
clear. But is the best thing just to look straight ahead and ignore it, or to look over at the other driver and smile? Is the best, what is the most loving thing to do given the possibilities I have in that scenario? And often in time, I'm kind of trying to discern competing lures and woos and opportunities to try to figure out what might be best. And I fail sometimes. This often happens in my family relationships. I think I'm doing what will be the best thing for my wife or my three daughters or my grandchildren, but it turns out they have different expectations, and I really missed the mark. My intentions and motives were good, but I misunderstood, I didn't discern well, and I act in ways that clearly didn't make the best of all possible worlds or to promote overall well-being. So those are two things that like quickly come to mind. Even when your intentions are pure and right and loving, you still have to deal sometimes with negative emotions, and it's not always clear about what the most loving thing to do is in any particular scenario.
That always for me is that, Jesus in the fig tree moment. Like, he cursed the fig tree. Come on.
That's right.
We're not expected to be perfect in every moment. We're going to do something and go, crap. That was not the right thing. That was really, I would go back and do that over again if I could do it. And this is the place for me that I kind of wrap back around into, what if God is not perfect?
Yeah.
How do we define this all-knowing, all-present, all everything God? And I struggle a little bit with what our human perception of perfection is, in the same way that you speak about, and I'm completely aligned with the idea that God is expanding with us, that we are all learning, growing, and that the knowledge that is the divine source grows as we grow. Which is that kind of clarifying statement that says that the future is not predetermined.
Right. Yep.
This other piece that is, what do we really mean by perfect? What is a perfect God? Is a perfect God an interfering and fixing God? Is a perfect God a God who allows us to have our imperfections? Do we think that God is imperfect?
Yeah. The summer before the pandemic began, I was invited to teach a course at University of Innsbruck, Austria, to a bunch of young analytic philosophers. And these were all philosophers who understood well what is in the academies called perfect being theology. That is, you begin the assumption that God is perfect, and then you try to cash out or figure out what that means, and all kinds of issues about what God knows, what God does, God's emotions, all that kind of stuff. So just about everybody at this conference that I was teaching at, they believed God was perfect. But when I started talking about the God I thought was perfect, it was a very different conception of God than they had. So we could all agree God was perfect, but what that actually meant differed pretty radically. Like, I think a perfect God is going to respond to what happens in the world, But a bunch of those people there thought God never responds because God is above any kind of change or any kind of emotion. I think you should start thinking about a perfect God with the issues of love in mind, and then understand other aspects of God in light of love. But a lot of the people at that conference, they wanted to start with God's omnipotence and then understand everything in light of that. So you can agree that God is perfect and have a very different notion of who God is and what God does. And so I'm not willing to throw out the word perfect when it comes to God. I think it has some helpfulness, but what you rightly point to is that there are very many different understandings of perfection. And what we think might be perfect, we might later on think, what I thought was perfect is probably not perfect. There's a better way to think about perfection. And that's an ongoing task, at least in my life, as I think about God.
And here's the other piece that I find interesting with people. I think many times we have our ideas about God, source, the holy, whatever is the God of your knowing, whatever is the
Yes,
name. And I always throw goddess in there because I think women need to see that feminine divine as well.
I agree. Yep.
No matter how you define that, no matter how it comes through you or what you see, once we get locked into what we believe, it's very difficult to question because
Yes.
our beliefs form the foundation of our lives. And
Yep.
we master our lives by moving in a particular form of alignment with whatever we have come to know or come to accept as true. So
Yeah.
it's
Great point.
it's always for me interesting to put these questions out, not because I want to ask anyone to change what you believe, but I want to ask you to be open to the possibility
Yes.
that you can go deeper into this.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. I have the opportunity to speak in a variety of faith and university settings. Some of them are pretty conservative. Others are quite liberal and progressive. And I've noticed over the years that those two kinds of communities oftentimes deal with different worries, at least I think are worries when it comes to God, the divine, goddess, whatever. The conservative circles tend to have more of a problem of, we've got God figured out. This is the way God is, let's close the door. If you don't believe like us, you're obviously stupid. You might even be going to hell. We're certain that God is X, Y, and Z. And I reject that. I don't think people can be certain about who God is. I don't even think you should be certain that God even exists. I think it's plausible, but I don't think you should be certain. In more progressive circles, I find people are really reacting strongly to that we've got God figured out view. And they like to throw the mystery card left, right, and center. God is mystery. God is wholly mysterious. And of course, I think there's always a role for mystery. But I don't think God is absolute mystery, because if God is absolute mystery, nothing we say, think, or could even imagine about God could be in any sense true, even partially true, if God is absolute mystery. So I proposed that we try to steer a middle way between being absolutely certain God exists and is like X, Y, and Z, or thinking God is absolute mystery, that we have absolutely no clue about who God is, and humbly admitting we haven't got God figured out, that we're always on a journey. Try to craft a vision of the divine that we think makes the best sense given our experience, given various sacred texts, given science, given all kinds of witnesses from religious traditions. Now, of course, that's just as you think about all the data that we're trying to bring together to try to formulate what this vision of the divine is, you're already seeing that it's an incredibly huge job. But I think it's better to be on that journey than to being on either the extreme of thinking you got all figured out and you're certain, or you're just throwing that mystery card left, right, and center, and it's all absolute mystery.
I love that you said that, because to me, that kind of encapsulates the idea of being in relationship with this divine source. If I think about relationship with my husband, for example, When I first met him, he was certainly a mystery to me. He was a very fascinating mystery to me. And we've been together now, over 20 years. And there is a lot about who he is that I feel pretty solid in. Yeah. I understand who he is. I understand what motivates him. I understand a lot about how he moves through my life in particular. And the flip side of that is I never want to get to the point where I have decided who he is to the point that I can no longer be surprised and amazed and sometimes even shocked because there's something I don't know. There's something that he's grown into, or something that hasn't been revealed that is new to me. And I find comfort in both sides of that. I find great comfort in knowing his heart deeply and feeling like I can count on him being that all the time. And also the great joy in life is in the kind of awestruck moments. And that's what I have in my experience with the Holy. I live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I live at the base of Pikes Peak. Oh, wow. I have lived here for 20 years, and there is not a day that I have the opportunity to come out of my home and see that beautiful mountain and not have it just take my breath away. That it is what it is. And that is the experience I want to remain open to with the divine. I want to have those awestruck moments where I see, a butterfly float by, and I am just amazed that creature can move the way it does. Or I see I listen to the giggle of my granddaughter and just, I'm like, my heart is so filled with love that anything in the universe could create something as amazing as that little child, right? So I love what you're saying about not getting locked in. And I think that ultimately is the purpose of this podcast, is to invite people to question where you're locked in. Notice the things that you have come to know from your own experience, because each of us will have different experience of the divine. But also notice the moments that are magical and mysterious and mystic, find those mystic moments, be open to those, and allow the Holy to bring joy and delight into your life.
That's beautiful. Can I add one little personal anecdote there?
As many as you like. That's what you're here for.
I think maybe some of the listeners and you might be able to relate to this. When I look back at some of the religious experiences I had as an evangelical, there was a time in my life I was really kind of embarrassed by what I said and did during those times. Because, I was like a lot of people. I thought I had things figured out, and I thought everybody had to have the kind of experience I had to really be legit. And, after I left that phase, I was kind of embarrassed by some of the things I said and did. But I'm now at a place where I can look back, and I still don't endorse everything I said and did, but I can see that those were genuine encounters with the loving Spirit. But my interpretation of what was going on is different now than it was then. And it could be that you and I and the people who are listening to this, we might look back in our lives and think about events that happened and have a different interpretation. It doesn't mean we have to deny that those things really happened, but now we think about them differently because we have changed in our way of thinking about this holy, this loving Spirit at work in the universe. And that's a way of kind of redeeming our past spiritual experiences in light of our present views of who God is.
And there are so many lessons in that about self-love and self-acceptance and growth and the nature of growth, and even forgiveness. I think when I think back into evangelical times when witnessing was part of my life, and I was pretty definitive about who you had to be and what you had to do get to the, get to that golden road in the future. And there has been time for me to really kind of come to a personal place of forgiveness, because I was working from what I knew at the time.
Yep. Yep.
And that brought me to where I am now, which is a very different place on the road. And isn't that what life is about anyway?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's the fear in more conservative circles is if you start asking questions, you might change your mind.
Right. Yeah. And you might have to admit you were wrong about something,
Yeah.
which I think it's good to admit you're wrong about something.
As do I. And the admitting you're wrong is only the first step on that journey.
Mm-hmm.
The understanding of what it is to love yourself enough to really see yourself as growing and learning.
Yep.
We can do that really easily for our kids, can't we? Like we
Yeah.
never get mad at them for what they did when they were 3. That was a long time ago, and look
Yep.
who you are and look what you became. And to
Yep.
have that understanding for ourselves also is important. And that's again why I think this kind of conversation is not meant to tell you what to believe. It's meant to invite you to ask yourself, am I locked into something? Does it serve me? Am I locked into it only because it serves me? Am I willing to live in a world that is not quite so neatly defined?
Mm-hmm.
And that's challenging, especially in times that are fearful and times of great change. And we certainly are living in that right now.
Yeah, we
So
are.
I want to ask you about symbology and interaction with the divine, because I am having worked in this kind of indigenous cultural background. Everything has a meaning to me. If it's a butterfly that floats by, it means something. If it's a squirrel in my yard, if it's raining today, if the river is flowing heavy or not, there's something. I experience the entirety of life as a communication from the divine. That is in my head. I know that I create that. Like that is I am totally open for source to be in conversation with me every single moment in everything I see and everything I experience. And that can be a lot in your head, but for me, it's kind of guided me through. And I know that you're a hiker. I know you're a photographer, and
Yes.
actually an incredibly talented photographer.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I really wonder if you experience the divine in those environments, and how, if you have that, when you talk about relational theology, how is the relationship? How do you have that relationship?
Yeah. Well, I'm like you. I try to be open to communication from the divine moment by moment, and that comes in many different forms. As a photographer, I have a number of different what's the right word? Different ways I'm attuned to creation, my environment, the landscape, animals, beauty, sunsets, horizons. um, and what I try to do is lead with my feelings. Um, and by feelings, I mean that in a very general, broad sense of feelings. I think we can have aesthetic feelings, for instance, and that means using my 5 senses, but also kind of intuitions about scenarios. Um, Let me give you an example of an intuition. A few years ago, I was in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, making photographs of this massive mountains, and I saw a young moose and her calf in a meadow. And I said to myself, I talk to animals all the time. So I moved over and I started talking to this mother and calf. And I could see with my eyes the way they began to feel calm around me, because I was using speaking low terms and or low tones, I should say. And and while I could visually see a kind of relaxation by the cow, the moose, um, I also intuited that it was it was okay to be there, okay to make these photographs of this calf and this cow with the background of these majestic mountains. Now that's bringing together all kinds of senses and non-sensory perception by letting my emotions, my feelings about my environment and the other actors and agents, forces and factors in an environment play a role in how I'm sensing what's going on. Now, is that God? Yes, I think God's present, but I don't think the moose is God or the mountain is God in the sense of being a pantheist. I think God is present in, through, and with all of creation. So I've got this combination of things coming together moment by moment, and with my feelings, my intuitions, trying to appreciate something valuable and make a photograph that captures something of the emotions I'm feeling at that moment. Um, that's just one illustration of how I think as a photographer in the natural landscape.
I'm excited that you talked about animals because there's a picture that I saw that you took that has a grizzly in it. And I
Yeah.
remember looking at that and thinking, that is way closer to that creature than I ever want to be.
Yeah.
But I think there is a sense in all life of peace and of threat. That's like sometimes you meet somebody and you can tell they're threatening you. They don't even have to speak, but
Yep.
And in
Yep.
other times we meet people who don't pose us any threat. And we know right away that, this is a person of love. This person is at peace. I don't have to be fearful. So it
I
makes
was
sense.
talking to that grizzly. That grizzly was about 100 yards away when I first saw it. I got out, got my camera, and she came closer and closer to me, and I kept talking to her, and she just kind of looked over at me, and yeah, it was a nice experience. My wife was actually in the car behind me. Well, I guess she did get out at one point, but she wasn't as close as I was. And she took her phone and did a little filming of me and this grizzly. And I was pretty close, but I didn't feel, I was careful, but I didn't feel threatened because, again, I was talking in low tones, and I was calling this. It was a sow. I was calling her my friend, and yeah, I don't know.
And I think those words, I'm often so fascinated with the power words have to change our state of being, but also the power that words have to change someone else's or something
Yes.
else's state of being. So when you use those words, my friend, then who you are and the energy that emanates from you is that energy. Is
Yes.
that, that thing that we feel amongst other humans when someone is a friend and when someone isn't, because our brain, right?
Yes.
What does this word mean?
I
What does
grew up
this
on
word
a
mean?
I grew up on a farm, and from a farmer's perspective, most farmers' perspectives, there's good animals and bad animals. On the farm, the good animals were the cats, the pigs, the cows. The bad animals were the coyotes. And as a kid, I would go with my dad, and he would shoot coyotes because we considered them bad. Well, as I got older and I had a different view of animals in the world, I said, I want to say, I want to become friends with the insects, the birds, the animals, even the snakes. I call rattlesnakes my friends. So I started developing this habit of whenever I was walking, whatever animal I saw, squirrel, mosquito, I'd say, hello, friend. Hello, friend. Even snakes and lizards, uh, deer. Hello, friend. I decided I was going to make this a habit in my life. One night, I wanted to make a photograph of petroglyphs and stars. And so I was waiting for the darkness to set in. And I'd seen a coyote in the distance while I'd set my tent up earlier that evening. But I was just kind of standing by this rock, just kind of looking at the stars, waiting for it to get dark enough for the kind of light I wanted. And I heard a little noise, and I turned around, and that coyote had walked up within 10 feet of me. And the first thing that came out of my mouth, not even thinking about it, was, hello, friend. because I had conditioned myself to encounter the creaturely other with this friendship motif. I just said, "Hello, friend." And the coyote sat down on his haunches, took his back leg, scratched his ear, just not caring at all that I was this close. I took my camera and tried to take a picture, and he kind of walked off into the darkness. I tell that story to say that's a way in which repeated actions, intentional actions on my part, change my orientation to other creatures in the world, such that it's not automatic as if I have no conscious choice, but it's such a habit now. It comes very naturally, even when I'm not intentionally thinking about it all the time, to think of others as my friends.
I love that. I have loved this conversation, and I am so grateful. I hope this is not the only conversation we have, because I expect you and I could talk for a very long time about a whole lot of things. So
Well, it's my honor and privilege to be the first guest in this series. Thanks so much for inviting me.
tell us a little bit, Tom, about how people can find more about you, because I know our listeners and viewers will want to know you better.
Yeah, as you said kind of early on, I'm pretty available through social media. I have a website that's my full name, Thomas Jay Oord. My middle name is Jay, last name Oord. But, if you just Google my name, Thomas Oord, you'll probably find some way to get in contact with me or find out about my directing doctoral programs, my writing books, speaking, whatever. I'm not too hard to find.
No, and not only are you not hard to find, but you're also very interactive. And I say that because that's one of the objectives of this whole A Soulfull World program, is to really allow people to have direct access with master teachers. Like there are some real masters in the world, and then there are, I think we've all experienced teachers who read a book and suddenly are the experts on something they don't really know very much about. So we're really working to provide an opportunity for people to meet and get to know accessible teachers who have something powerful to share in the world. So please, we encourage you to go out, find the website, find the Facebook page, listen to the podcasts. You have been a delight, Tom. I look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks again for the opportunity, Ahriana.